Distinction students, civic education with a perfect tutor. So we are looking at a new topic, which is the International Human Rights Instruments. International Human Rights Instruments. Now, what are we going to focus on in this video? So I want to show you the chart of the International Human Rights Instruments. So when you hear the word International Bill of Rights, International Bill of Rights, it comprises the three documents that you're seeing on top. First of all, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR. So the ICCPR has two optional protocols. So these three documents make up what we call the International Bill of Rights. Remember, when we were dealing with the Zambian Bill of Rights, we said it largely reflects the provisions contained in the International Human Rights Instruments. So the first three here are the International Human Rights Instruments. They are the ones that make up the International Bill of Rights. So apart from this, the International Bill of Rights, we also have the specialized instruments. So among the specialized instruments, we have International Convention on the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination, the Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, the Convention against torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. Then we have the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of all Migrant Workers and members of their families. So these are specialized instruments. Why are they called specialized instruments? They deal with specific topics or subjects or groups of people. So in this video, we are going to focus on the International Bill of Rights only. We are just going to talk about the three documents that make up the International Bill of Rights. Then in part 2, we'll talk about the specialized human rights instruments. Great. So International Human Rights Instruments and International Bill of Rights are two different things. Do not confuse them. So what are International Human Rights Instruments? So these refer to the institutions and mechanisms that are used to promote and protect human rights, such as the right to life, right to vote, right to education, etc. That is the meaning of International Human Rights Instruments. But International Bill of Rights, you are going to see. So we have types of International Human Rights Instruments, because we have said these are just institutions or mechanisms that are used to promote and protect human rights. Those are human rights instruments. Now let us talk about the types of these International Human Rights Instruments. Number one, we have the International Bill of Rights. It is a mechanism that is used to promote and protect human rights. Then secondly, we have specialized human rights instruments. So in this video, like I said, we're just going to talk about the International Bill of Rights. So this one is made up of three main international human rights instruments, namely the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You know, when you hear these things, do not be confused. They are just like the Zambian Bill of Rights. Remember, that's just a document. That's just a document. And for us, it's just part of the Constitution that has got the rights. So even these, they are just documents which articulate rights of people, rights of human beings. So firstly, we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR, adopted in 1948. Secondly, we have the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR of 1966, and its two optional protocols. So the ICCPR has two optional protocols. Now we are going to learn what optional protocols are. Then we have the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the ICESCR of 1966. So this one has no optional protocols. Remember when we were dealing with Introduction to Human Rights, we talked about the categories of human rights, which we had civil and political rights, economic, social and cultural rights. So even here, these things are there. Let us talk about the charter-based international human rights instruments, having known the three documents that make up the International Bill of Rights. Let us start with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I've said it's a charter-based international human rights instrument. Why is it called a charter-based human rights instrument? It was adopted by the United Nations Charter. Now, what is a charter? When we are learning about civil society and media and governance, we talked about the international organization. A group of international organizations is called a charter. A group of international organizations is called a charter. So this instrument begins with a preamble. A preamble is simply an introduction. So this preamble states the values and beliefs of the document. It is an internationally recognized and agreed upon instrument. Look at this. It is an internationally recognized. When you talk about the Zambian Bill of Rights, it only applies to Zambia. You cannot go to South Africa and say, no, Article so in our Bill of Rights say there is protection against torture or inhuman treatment, hence you are not allowed to mistreat me. No, that Bill of Rights only applies to Zambia. But for this one, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it is an internationally recognized and agreed upon instrument. Internationally recognized. So it's not like the Zambian Bill of Rights, through which individuals and governments can work and deliver basic rights. So it was adopted on 10th December 1948 by the United Nations in Geneva. Now, what led to the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948? So there was the brutal killing of the Jews by the Nazi Germany during the Second World War. The Jews were being killed. So the United Nations had to sit down and say, human beings are dying. So what can we do for us to save the Jews from this? So they came up with rights. They said every human being has got rights. The right to life, right to education, and other things. Because the Jews were not considered to be important. They were not considered to be important because there were no rights at that time. So the UN sat down and adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was simply a set of rights of human beings. In 1948 in Geneva, that's where they adopted this instrument from. So this declaration contains 30 articles, which are a list of basic rights every human being is born with and can be divided into two themes: civil and political rights, as well as economic and social and cultural rights. Economic, social and cultural rights. So the Zambian Bill of Rights has got articles 11 to 32. Those are the articles where we can find the rights. But for the UDHR, it has 30 articles. 30 articles. These are just basic rights which every human being is born with. Now, we can divide them into two themes: civil and political rights and economic and social cultural. Economic, social and cultural rights. Summary of provisions. I won't describe all the articles. I'll just talk about 8, but there are 30. Everyone is born in freedom, equality, and dignity. Everyone has the right not to be discriminated against on any basis. Everyone has the right to life and to live in freedom and safety. Everyone has the right to liberty or freedom. That's why we said the Zambian Bill of Rights largely reflects the provisions contained in the International Bill of Rights. You can see here. Everyone has the right to security of person, as no one should be tortured or suffer from cruel and inhuman treatment. Everyone has the right to equality before the law and equal protection. Everyone has the right to recognition before the law. So these are some of the articles of the UDHR. The UDHR. I would urge you to research more and know the other 23 articles, because these are just 7. So you have to know the other 23 articles. Great. So that is about the UDHR. Let us talk about the treaty-based international human rights instruments. Remember, we said the articles contained in the UDHR can be divided into 2 themes: civil and political rights, as well as economic, social, and cultural rights. So further documents were formed following these 2 themes. We have the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So this one only took the part of economic, social, and cultural rights. It expanded only the economic, social, and cultural rights. Why are they called the treaty-based human rights instruments? They can also be called covenants or conventions. It's just the same. Treaty, covenant, convention. They are just one and the same thing. So, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not a binding document. It is just a declaration. Those rights which are there are just a declaration. And any state that signs up for it is agreeable with the content in the declaration, but does not commit itself to be bound to implement the provisions in it. It does not commit itself to be bound to implement the provisions in it. Now, for the treaty-based instruments, they are legally binding to the state that is party to it. They are legally binding to the state that is party to it. What does this mean? This means that the state party is bound to not only translate the provisions into domestic law, but also to implement the provisions of the treaty, different from the UDHR. For the UDHR, the country cannot be forced to implement the provisions in it. It's just a declaration. But for the treaty-based human rights instruments, once a country or a state is a party to it, the state will be bound to not only translate the provisions into domestic law, but also to implement the provisions of the treaty. Now, these treaties are legally binding on the states that are party to them, not to all the states. So being a party to a treaty means that a country has either ratified or acceded the treaty. That's what it means. Being a party to a treaty means a country has either ratified or acceded the treaty. Now, what is to ratify? So, to ratify is when a state agrees to be bound by a treaty that it has already signed. When a state agrees to be bound by a treaty that it has already signed. How do they do this? The state does this by writing a memo called Instrument of Ratification and depositing it with the United Nations Secretary General. They will write a memo called Instrument of Ratification and they will deposit it with the United Nations Secretary General. That is the meaning of to ratify. So, remember, To ratify a treaty, the state must have first signed to it. To ratify a treaty, the state must have first signed it. So here it will just agree to be bound by that treaty that it has already signed. Now, let us talk about acceding or accession. To accede to a treaty is when a state agrees to be bound by the treaty without first having signed it. So these two have got the same effect, but it says that for ratification, the state agrees to be bound by a treaty that it has already signed. But for accession, the state agrees to be bound by a treaty without signing it first. That is the meaning. How does a state accede to a treaty? Even here, the state has to write a memo called Instrument of Accession and deposit it with the United Nations Secretary General. So these two, ratification and accession, have the same legal effect. But the only difference is that for ratification, the state agrees to be bound by a treaty that it has already signed. Accession, the state agrees to be bound by a treaty without first signing it. So I have explained the meaning of treaty-based international human rights instruments. So this is an exact, we are now talking about the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights as one of the treaty-based international human rights instruments. So this is an exact of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was also an effort to come up with a legally binding document. It was formed in 1966. These rights are problematic because they are dependent on resources for their realization. Economic, social, and cultural rights. So these were just extracted or derived from the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This document expanded on the economic, social, and cultural rights. Because for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's like a combination. It's just too general. All the rights are there. Now, this document expanded on a specific theme of economic, social, and cultural rights. That's why we are saying it is an exact of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So the preamble gives an outline for the explanation of the rights in the covenant and talks about what is contained in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because these rights in the covenant are based on the inherent dignity of the human person. The preamble also emphasizes the indivisibility and interdependency of all human rights by stating that the ideal of free human beings enjoying freedom from fear and want can only be achieved if conditions are created in which every human being can enjoy his economic, social, and cultural rights as well as his civil and political rights. This is what the preamble outlines. This topic is very interesting, and when they bring it, I'm telling you, it won't be a simple question. They'll just ask you to outline the preamble of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Then you scratch your head. So this is the preamble. Summary of the provisions in the ICESCR. Right to work, right to just and favorable conditions of work, including fair wages, equal pay for equal work, and holidays with pay. Right to form and join trade unions, including the right to strike. Right to social security, protection of the family, including special assistance for mothers and children, right to adequate standard of living, including food, clothing, and housing, right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, right to education, right to participate in the cultural life and enjoy the benefits of scientific progress. So this is the summary of the provisions in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. When you look at these rights, a lot of them were covered when we were doing Introduction to Human Rights, Categories of Human Rights, specifically on the economic, social, and cultural rights. You can go and check your notes there. You'll find these rights there. That is the International Covenant or Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural rights. Now let us talk about the last one, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So this one also expanded on civil and political rights. So it's just like we get the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We divide it into two themes. We get civil and political rights as well as economic, social, and cultural rights. Then we form documents to specifically explain these two themes. So the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights expands on civil and political rights only, the ICCPR, adopted in 1966 as well. So this came into force in 1966 and is legally binding to its member states. States which are party to them. These are treaty-based human rights instruments. So these are rights that are easy to nurture and implement because they require no big investments for them to be enjoyed. The preamble, which is the introduction of this document, states that the ideal of free human beings enjoying freedom from fear and want can only be achieved if conditions are created in which everyone can enjoy his economic, social, and cultural rights as well as his civil and political rights. That's the preamble. So it's just the same because these are just extractions of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So they simply talk about the same thing, though they are specialized. For this one, it is specialized in the civil and political rights. That one is just the economic, social, and cultural rights. So this treaty expands on the civil and political rights set out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR, with the exception of the right to property and right to asylum. So it expands on civil and political rights set out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but except two rights, right to property and right to asylum. It doesn't talk about this. So they can say, list two exceptional rights of the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. You scratch your head. International Bill of Rights is a very difficult topic. It's very simple. So we have right to property and right to asylum. Summary of provisions in the ICCPR. Right to life. Freedom from torture and inhuman treatment. Freedom from slavery and forced labor. Right to liberty and security. Right of detained persons to be treated with humanity. Freedom from imprisonment for debt. Freedom of movement and choice of residence. Freedom of aliens from arbitrary expulsion. Right to a fair trial. As you have seen, these rights are civil and political rights. We covered them when we were doing Introduction to Human Rights. Very simple. And most of these rights here appear in the Zambian Bill of Rights. That's why we're saying it reflects, I repeat, it reflects. The Zambian Bill of Rights reflects the provisions contained in the International Bill of Rights. So these were the three documents that we are listing, that we are talking about when we're saying the Zambian Bill of Rights reflects the provisions contained in the International Bill of Rights. Now, the ICCPR has got two optional protocols. The other one has no optional protocols, but this one has got two optional protocols. What is an optional protocol? So an optional protocol is a provision attached to an international human rights instrument in order to offer more protection. So the ICCPR has two optional protocols. The first optional protocol and the second optional protocol. I hope you have understood what an optional protocol is. Simply a provision attached to an international human rights instrument in order to offer more protection. So the first optional protocol to the ICCPR was adopted in 1976. This provision allows individuals to complain to the United Nations Human Rights Commission on issues of human rights violations contained in the ICCPR, provided they exhaust all the channels of complaints, usually through the courts of law. So if your rights have been violated, you go to court. Now, you are not satisfied with the court ruling. Where else can you go? You have the right to go to the United Nations Human Rights Commission. You have the right to go to the United Nations Human Rights Commission and complain to say your rights were violated and the court ruling was not pleasing to you. You were not satisfied. So you want more protection of your rights. So Zambia is a state party to this protocol. So you can go to the United Nations Human Rights Commission. Then the second option protocol adopted in 1990. This aims at abolishing death penalty in countries that ratified. And Zambia is not a state party to the second option protocol. That's why they had to decide on its own whether to abolish death penalty or not. Whether to abolish death penalty or not. Because it's not a state party to the second optional protocol. If it was a state party to the second optional protocol, automatically death penalty would have been abolished. That's how these human rights instruments work. So, as you can see, these optional protocols here, it says that the name sounds too technical, but they are simple. They're just provisions to offer more protection to the rights contained in the ICCPR. So it's not only the ICCPR that can have optional protocols, even other human rights instruments can have provisions attached to them in order to offer more protection to the rights that are contained in that document. So these are the two optional protocols that are attached to the